Where did they come from? A faint speck on the ancient world's map, or an idea destined to rule? 1,000 years have passed, yet the question of Rome and its extraordinary military might endures, challenging our understanding. How could a humble tribe by the Tiber River forge legions that made the world tremble, building an empire whose shadow still stretches over us today? Many call it fate, but a closer look reveals a far more complex story. A long chain of relentless adaptation, bold reforms, and even brutal gambles. This is more than just glorious battles. This is a journey into the heart of a war machine, where discipline, engineering, and an unshakable will converge. Together, we will turn back the pages of history, seeking answers to the mystery of their rise and enduring strength. Do the lessons from this distant past still hold value, or are they merely echoes from a bygone era? Let us begin the journey to uncover a military legacy that shaped the world. Before we dive deep into epic Roman battles and the incredible resilience of Byzantium, a quick question for you. Where in our beautiful world are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments below. I'm super curious to see how far our history-loving community stretches. And hey, if you're as excited as I am for the journey ahead, from humble tribal militias to invincible legions, from the invention of the corvus that conquered the seas to the terrifying cataphracts, or the mystery behind the Greek fire that saved Constantinople, then don't hesitate to hit that like button for this video. More importantly, if you don't want to miss a single detail about the rise of Hannibal, Caesar's brilliant Gallic campaigns, Diocletian's desperate reforms, or Byzantium's astonishing endurance through centuries of conflict, from Justinian's reconquests to the fateful Battle of Manzikert and the tragic fall of Constantinople in 1453, then make sure you hit subscribe and ring that notification bell. Because, I promise you, what we're about to explore isn't just dry facts. We'll analyze the tactics, the innovations, and the pivotal decisions that shaped military history. We'll ask questions and find unique lenses to view the past. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll have a whole new perspective on the power, adaptability, and enduring legacy of history's greatest war machines. So, stick around till the very end. So much incredible stuff is coming your way. Now, let's turn back the wheels of time. Part 1. The Dawn of Power. The Republic rises 753 BCE to 27 BCE. Before the crimson-clad legions marched through the paved streets of a mighty empire, before the emperors and the Grand Colosseum there were only hills. 7 hills, nestled beside the gentle Tiber River. And on those hills, simple huts, belonging to shepherds, to farmers. These were the first Romans. No one could have guessed that from this modest embryo, a power would rise, a power that would shape the entire ancient world. How could these tillers of the soil, these tribal militias accustomed only to defending their own small plots, forge an army that would make the Italian peninsula tremble? Their story doesn't begin with easy victories, but with a relentless struggle for survival. They faced stronger neighbors, more advanced cultures like the Etruscans. And they learned. They observed, they adapted. One of the first turning points, legend tells us, was the reform of Servius Tullius. This wasn't merely a census. It was the first institutionalization of a revolutionary idea. Citizenship must go hand in hand with the responsibility to defend the state. Your wealth determined your place in the ranks, and that laid the foundation for an organized citizen army. But theory is one thing, the reality of the battlefield another. Rome's early history was written in blood and iron through incessant warfare. The Latin Wars, clashes with Etruscan city-states, and especially the long and brutal Samnite Wars. The Samnites, formidable mountain warriors, were not easily subdued. They taught Rome bitter lessons. The Battle of Sentinum in 295 BCE was a prime example. It wasn't just a battle, it was an affirmation that Rome now possessed the strength to defeat the most powerful coalitions. And then, like a cruel test of fate, in 390 BCE, disaster struck. The Gauls, wild northern warriors, swept down, crushed the young Roman army at the Battle of the Allia, and sacked Rome itself. It seemed like the end. The beloved city lay personage, pride trampled. Any other people might have crumbled, but not Rome. From the ashes of defeat, a new resolve was forged. They rebuilt their walls, and more importantly, they reformed their army. Perhaps it was during those arduous wars against the Samnites in the treacherous hill country that the Romans realized the limitations of the heavy, rigid phalanx formation draw on the Greek model. They needed flexibility, and they found it, or perhaps learned it, from their very enemies. The manipular legion was born. 3 lines of troops, hastati, principes, triarii, like successive waves, capable of maneuvering, supporting each other, adapting to any terrain. It was a tactical revolution, a key element in their later successes. Astonishing pragmatism. Rome was willing to learn from anyone, even its foes, to become stronger. That was a characteristic that would define their greatness. And to legitimize their ever-expanding conquests, they created a concept. Bellum istum, a just war. It sounds noble, doesn't it? The official priests would perform complex rituals before war could be declared, stating that the war must have a just cause, to defend oneself, to avenge a wrong, or to uphold a treaty. But was it truly a moral check, or a sophisticated tool to cloak expansionist ambitions in the mantle of righteousness? History, it seems, often favored the latter interpretation. And so, from these initial seeds, relentless adaptation, an ideology serving a greater purpose, and a citizen army increasingly forged in the crucible of war, motivated by its own rights and responsibilities, the foundations of a military superpower were laid. They had mastered the Italian peninsula. But the world beyond was far vaster, and the real challenges had only just begun. Could they face the storms brewing personage the seas, where another power, a worthy rival, held sway? 2 giants now stood facing each other across the azure waters of the Mediterranean. Carthage, Queen of the Seas, a mighty commercial empire with vast fleets and rich lands in North Africa, Spain, and most importantly, the strategic island of Sicily, and Rome, having just unified Italy, brimming with the vigor of a young conqueror, now also began to look personage. Sicily, that fertile landmass lying just off the toe of the Italian boot, became the inevitable flashpoint. The Mediterranean, it seemed, was not big enough for both of them. A fateful confrontation was about to begin, a confrontation that would last for over a century, and it would change the world forever. These were the Punic Wars. At this time, Rome had almost no significant navy. How could a land-based power challenge a maritime empire that had dominated sea lanes for hundreds of years? It seemed an impossible task. But the Romans, as we have seen, possessed an astonishing adaptability and an iron will. They quickly built a large fleet, learning from captured Carthaginian ships, and then they came up with an ingenious invention, a strange weapon called the corvus, a boarding bridge with an iron spike at its end. When 2 ships came close, the corvus would be dropped, embedding itself firmly into the enemy's deck, turning the naval battle into a land engagement where the battle-hardened Roman legionaries held the absolute advantage. Suddenly, the tables turned. Decisive naval victories at Mylae and then the Aegates Islands forced Carthage to cede Sicily and pay a massive war indemnity. Rome had not only won, they had become a naval power in a remarkably short time. That was the first lesson in their resilience and extraordinary ability to learn during this life, or death struggle. But Carthage did not easily accept defeat, and from the heart of that wounded empire, a military genius emerged, a name that would sow terror throughout Rome for years to come: Hannibal Barca. He had harbored an undying hatred for Rome since childhood. Bold, decisive, with a brilliant strategic mind, Hannibal did the unthinkable. He led a formidable army, including terrifying war elephants across the majestic, snow-covered Alps, appearing in Rome's own backyard. Hannibal's initial victories over Roman legions at Trebia and Lake Trasimene were shocking. And then, in 216 BCE, at Cannae, it wasn't just a battle, it was a tactical masterpiece by Hannibal, and the most devastating military disaster in Roman history up to that point. Using a perfect double envelopment tactic, Hannibal, though outnumbered, virtually annihilated a massive Roman army. Tens of thousands of Romans lay dead on the field. Rome stood on the brink of collapse. News of Cannae spread, many of Rome's allies began to waver, some even defecting to Hannibal. Was this the end of Rome's ambitions? Any other state might have sued for peace, might have accepted defeat. But Rome was different. It was in their darkest hours that their resilience burned brightest. They refused to surrender. The Senate, despite losing many of its finest members, remained steadfast. They adopted the Fabian, strategy, named after the dictator Fabius Maximus, who advocated avoiding direct engagement with Hannibal, instead harassing him, cutting off his supply lines, gradually wearing down his forces. It was an unglamorous strategy, even ridiculed by many, but it bought Rome time, allowing it to regroup. And then, from the depths of despair, a new star emerged. Publius Cornelius Scipio. Young, but full of talent and ambition, Scipio did not believe that defense alone was enough. He proposed a daring plan, not to confront Hannibal directly in Italy, but to attack Hannibal's own homeland, Carthage, in North Africa. It was a huge gamble, but it paid off. Scipio's campaigns in Spain cut off Hannibal's vital supplies, and finally Hannibal was forced to leave Italy, the land he had rampaged through for 15 years, to return and defend his home. In 212 BCE, at Zama, on African soil, the two great generals finally faced each other. Scipio, later honored as Africanus, had studied Hannibal's tactics intently. He found a way to counter the fearsome war elephants, and in a tense battle, decisively defeated Hannibal's army. The Second Punic War was over. Carthage was severely weakened, stripped of its overseas territories, its fleet disbanded, and forced to pay another massive war indemnity. Rome had won. Hannibal may have won every battle, but Rome had won the war. Why? It was their depth of manpower, a more stable political system capable of mobilizing the entire nation's strength, and above all, an unyielding will. The Third Punic War, which took place a few decades later, was more like a tragic epilogue than a balanced contest. Obsessed by a lingering fear of Carthaginian resurgence, and spurred on by figures like Cato the Elder with his famous cry, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Rome sought every means to utterly annihilate its old rival. After a brutal 3-year siege, Carthage was literally razed to the ground. The city was burned, the land sown with salt, so that nothing could ever grow there again. Its people were enslaved. It was an act of brutal, absolute power, a warning to the rest of the world. The Punic Wars had forged Rome in fire and blood. They brought not only territory and wealth, but also profoundly shaped the nature of the Republic and its military machine. The army became increasingly professionalized, and successful generals, like Scipio, began to accumulate enormous personal power and prestige. And Rome's foreign policy grew harsher, more willing to use overwhelming force to eliminate any threat, however potential. But with no worthy external rivals left, would the seeds of conflict begin to sprout from within the heart of an increasingly vast and complex republic? Indeed, the Roman eagle now spread its wings across the Mediterranean. After Carthage, it was the turn of the Hellenistic kingdoms in the east to feel Rome's might. The Macedonian Wars ended with Macedon becoming a Roman province. Greece, the cradle of Western civilization, also fell under Roman control. The powerful Seleucid Empire of Antiochus the Great in Asia Minor was also defeated, extending Rome's influence further eastward. In the west, the conquest and pacification of Hispania was a long and arduous process, but ultimately successful. Rome was now an empire, in fact, even if still a republic in name. But external glory often masked internal problems. The constant wars in distant lands demanded longer terms of service, making the traditional citizen militia system, where farmers left their fields to fight seasonally, increasingly inadequate. Who would replace them? Who would fight in campaigns that lasted for years? The answer came from another pivotal figure, Gaius Marius. Around 107 BCE, facing a shortage of soldiers, Marius enacted a series of far-reaching reforms. Most importantly, he opened up the army to landless citizens, the caput censi, who were previously ineligible to serve. In return, they would be equipped and paid by the state. This created a professional army, soldiers who saw military service as a career, serving for longer terms, and whose loyalty often lay more with their commanding general, who promised them booty and land upon retirement, than with the distant Senate in Rome. The legion was also reorganized into cohorts, each of about 480 men, increasing its flexibility and fighting power. Marius had created a more efficient, more mobile, and more formidable war machine, but he had also unwittingly sown the seeds for the downfall of the very republic he served. Because now, generals had at their disposal armies loyal to them personally, ready to follow their orders, whether those orders went against the will of the Senate or not. A prime example of the power of this reformed army and the ambition of its generals was Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, lasting from 58 to 50 BCE, Gaul was not just a conquest to expand Roman territory. For Caesar, it was also a means to build military prestige, accumulate wealth, and most importantly, forge a battle-hardened army utterly loyal to him. The Gauls, though divided into many tribes, resisted bravely, especially under the leadership of Vercingetorix. But ultimately, they could not withstand the discipline, superior engineering skills, and strategic genius of Caesar and his legions. The Battle of Alesia in 52 BCE, a masterpiece of siege warfare, marked the decisive defeat of the Gallic coalition. The vast territory of Gaul now belonged to Rome, and Caesar became a hero, an invincible general. But Caesar's power and glory, like that of other successful generals such as Pompey, became a threat to the fragile stability of the Republic. Deep-seated socio-economic tensions, the widening gap between rich and poor, the displacement of small farmers, the rise of slave labor, coupled with political factionalism between the Optimates, conservative aristocrats, and populars, the People's Party, created a powder keg ready to explode. And explode it did. A series of devastating civil wars tore the Republic apart. Marius against Sulla, with Sulla, for the first time in history, leading a Roman legion into Rome itself, a shocking precedent. And then, the inevitable clash between the two giants, Caesar and Pompey. When the Senate, under Pompey's influence, ordered Caesar to disband his army after his Gallic campaigns, Caesar made a historic decision. He led his legion across the Rubicon River into Italy, an act tantamount to declaring war. Alia acta est. The die is cast. Battles like Pharsalus, where Caesar decisively defeated Pompey, and Munda, which crushed the last remnants of Pompey's faction, confirmed Caesar's victory. He became dictator of Rome, holding absolute power, but his triumph was also the death knell for the nearly 500-year-old republic. The old institutions were broken, the old aristocracy decimated, and the way was paved for a new form of rule, a new order. The republic was dead, killed by its own most brilliant sons, its most capable generals. From the ashes of bloody civil wars, an empire would rise, built on the foundation of undisputed military might. And so, a new question arose. Could this empire maintain the peace and stability that the Republic had failed to achieve, or would it too fall prey to conflict and violence? The story of Rome, the story of its war machine, still had many dramatic chapters yet to unfold. Part 2. The Imperial War Machine, Pax Romana and Frontiers 27 BCE to 284 CE. The Republic lay in ruins, its ideals shattered, its great men fallen in decades of bloody civil war. Rome, the eternal city, was exhausted, bleeding, and yearned for an end to the endless strife that had torn it asunder. And from the smoldering embers of that chaos, a figure emerged, a young man of extraordinary political acumen, the adopted son and heir to the murdered Julius Caesar. His name was Octavian, but history would remember him by the honorific title bestowed upon him by a grateful, or perhaps simply cowed Senate, Augustus. He brought what Rome so desperately craved: peace. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, an era of unprecedented stability and prosperity that would, for the most part, endure for nearly 2 centuries. But this peace, this seemingly tranquil epoch that allowed culture to flourish and commerce to span the known world, was not built on gentle persuasion or enlightened philosophy alone. It was forged in the crucible of the legions, maintained by the unshakable, ever-present might of a reformed and utterly loyal imperial army. Augustus, a master strategist not just on the battlefield, but in the far more treacherous arena of Roman politics, understood a fundamental truth that the Republic, in its dying days, had fatally ignored. To control a vast and fractious empire, stretching from the mists of Britain to the deserts of Syria, he needed an army loyal not to individual, ambitious generals with their own agendas, but to the emperor himself, to the very concept of the principate he was so carefully constructing. And so, with meticulous care and ruthless efficiency, he set about reshaping the Roman military. The enormous, often undisciplined, ad hoc armies of the late Republic, those vast personal fiefdoms that had followed men like Pompey, Caesar, Antony, and indeed himself, were largely disbanded. The number of legions was drastically reduced, from over 60 at the height of the civil wars to a more manageable, and more importantly, more controllable 28, later settling around 25 to 30 for much of the early imperial period. Their structures were standardized, their pay and conditions of service regularized, and, crucially, these legions were no longer raised and disbanded for specific campaigns. They became a standing, professional force, permanently garrisoned in purpose-built fortresses, the Castra Legionaria, strategically positioned along the sprawling, often turbulent, frontiers of the empire. The Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, these rivers became the fortified sinews of Roman power, patrolled by the ever-watchful legionaries. Each legion bore its own unique number, and often a distinctive title, an agnomen, earned through valor or commemorating its place of origin or a significant victory. These names, Legio ex Gemina, Legio Thur Gallica, Legio Sextum Primigenia, became imbued with history, tradition, and a fierce esprit de corps. But the ultimate symbol of a legion's honor, its very soul, was its aquila, the sacred eagle standard, typically made of silver or gold. To lose the aquila in battle was the ultimate disgrace, a stain upon the legion's honor that could only be erased by its recapture, often at enormous cost. The aquilifer, the soldier entrusted with carrying this hallowed standard, was a figure of immense prestige and responsibility. And to further cement this direct allegiance to the new imperial order, another standard was introduced, the imago, a standard bearing the sculpted image of the reigning emperor. The imaginifer, its bearer, served as a constant, visible reminder that these soldiers fought not for a distant, often fractious senate, nor for a charismatic general, but for Caesar Augustus, their supreme commander, the guarantor of their pay, their land upon retirement, and the stability of the empire itself. It was a subtle, psychological shift, perhaps, but one of profound and lasting importance. No longer would legions be so easily turned into instruments of personal ambition. They were now, first and foremost, the enforcers of imperial will. These legionaries were, in theory, Roman citizens, volunteers who signed on for a long term of service, typically 20 years, later extended to 25. Initially, many were recruited from Italy, but as the empire matured and the demands for manpower grew, recruitment increasingly shifted to the Romanized provinces of Gaul, Spain, and the Balkans. This created a self-perpetuating cycle. Provincials served in the legions, became thoroughly Romanized, and upon retirement, often settled in the frontier regions, further spreading Roman culture and creating a pool of potential future recruits from among their sons. The life of a legionary was hard, disciplined, and often dangerous, but it offered a steady wage, the prospect of donative sebens bonuses from the emperor on special occasions, and, most importantly, a substantial discharge bonus upon completion of service, either a plot of land in a veteran colony or a lump sum of cash. This created a distinct military class with its own culture, its own loyalties, and a profound stake in the stability and prosperity of the empire they defended. But the heavy infantry legions, formidable as they were, could not do everything. They were the iron fist of Rome, but they needed a more flexible, versatile hand. And this was provided by the auxilia, the non-citizen provincial troops, who became an official, organized, and absolutely indispensable component of the imperial army, often matching, and sometimes even exceeding, the legionaries in sheer numbers. These auxiliaries were typically recruited from among the less Romanized peoples of the empire, often those with specific martial traditions, fierce Gallic or Germanic horsemen, skilled archers from Syria or Crete, slingers from the Balearic Islands. They were organized into smaller, more specialized units. Cavalry LR of wings, typically around 500 strong, infantry cohorts peditar as infantry cohorts, also around 500, and mixed infantry and cavalry units, the cohorts equitata. These auxiliary units provided the crucial reconnaissance, skirmishing, and cavalry support that the heavily armored legionary infantry often lacked. They patrolled the frontiers, garrisoned smaller forts, and fought alongside the legions in major campaigns, often bearing the brunt of the initial fighting or pursuing a broken enemy. Service in the auxilia was also for a long term, usually 25 years, and the reward at the end was highly coveted. Roman citizenship, not just for the retiring soldier himself, but also for his children. This was a powerful incentive, a transformative mechanism for Romanization, gradually integrating vast numbers of provincial peoples into the legal and cultural fabric of the Roman world. The diplomas, bronze tablets issued to retiring auxiliaries, attesting to their grant of citizenship and the right of legal marriage, are poignant testaments to this process, found scattered across the former territories of the empire. The auxilia, therefore, were not just a military adjunct, they were a vital tool of imperial assimilation and social mobility. An army, however loyal, however well-structured, however numerous, is only as effective as its ability to move, to build, to fortify, and to sustain itself over vast distances and in hostile environments. And here, the Romans were unparalleled masters, their military prowess inextricably linked with their engineering genius. They didn't just conquer with the sword and the pilum, they conquered with the pickaxe, the shovel, the measuring rod, and an almost obsessive attention to logistical detail. Across the length and breadth of the empire, a vast network of roads was constructed, marvels of engineering that endured for centuries, some still visible, even usable today. These weren't just arteries for trade and communication, though they served that purpose admirably. They were primarily military highways, designed for the rapid deployment of legions to any troubled frontier, for the swift delivery of supplies, and for the unambiguous projection of Roman power. Paved, drained, and remarkably straight, they allowed Roman armies to march with astonishing speed and efficiency regardless of weather or terrain. Fortifications, too, were a Roman specialty, an art form honed through centuries of warfare. The standardized, almost ritualistic, layout of the temporary marching camps, the castra aestiva, which could be erected with practiced speed by the legionaries at the end of each day's march, complete with ditches, ramparts, and palisades, provided secure nightly encampment even deep within enemy territory. This discipline and foresight gave Roman armies a crucial advantage, allowing them to rest securely and maintain cohesion, where other armies might be vulnerable to surprise attacks. But beyond these temporary fieldworks, Rome invested enormous resources in colossal permanent frontier defenses. Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a stone barrier stretching 73 miles from coast to coast, complete with forts, mile castles, and turrets, was not just a defensive line, it was a statement of imperial limits, a means of controlling movement, and a visible symbol of Roman order imposed upon a barbarian landscape. Similar, though often less monumental, systems of forts, watchtowers, and linked barriers, known collectively as the limes, demarcated and defended the Rhine and Danube frontiers in Europe, and the desert frontiers of the East. These were not just passive barriers designed to keep enemies out, they were integrated defensive systems, bases for patrols, and platforms for launching punitive expeditions into hostile territory. And when cities or enemy strongholds dared to resist Roman might, they faced the terrifying and methodical application of Roman siegecraft. This was not a matter of disorganized assaults or prolonged, hopeful blockades. Roman siege warfare was a science, a terrifying spectacle of engineering prowess and relentless pressure. Legions were equipped with sophisticated artillery, like the ballistae large crossbow, like devices firing heavy bolts or stones, and onagers, powerful catapults, hurling massive projectiles, capable of battering down walls and demoralizing defenders. Siege towers, often built on site and taller than the enemy's fortifications, would be rolled forward, allowing attackers to gain the ramparts. Battering rams, protected by heavy sheds, would pound relentlessly at gates and walls, and if a direct assault proved too costly, the Romans would resort to intricate siege works, constructing lines of circumvallation, a wall built around the besieged city to prevent breakout or relief, and sometimes even contravallation, a second wall facing outwards to protect the besiegers from a relieving army. Caesar's siege of Alesia in Gaul remains a classic example of this methodical, inescapable application of engineering to achieve military victory. Tunnels would be dug, ramparts raised, and slowly, inexorably, the defenders would be starved or battered into submission. This colossal, continent-spanning war machine, of course, needed to be fed, equipped, and paid. Logistics, the often unsung hero of military history, was the silent, indispensable backbone of Roman military success. An intricate and highly organized system of supply depots, the Horia, strategically located along major routes and in frontier regions, stored vast quantities of grain, wine, oil, and other essential supplies. Convoys of wagons, drawn by oxen or mules, and vast trains of pack animals trundled along those famous Roman roads, ferrying provisions to the legions. Foraging and, more often, requisitioning supplies from the local provincial populations through a system known as the annona militaris were standard practice. While necessary for the army's survival, This could often place a heavy burden on the provincials, sometimes leading to resentment, though generally, the stability and security provided by the army were seen as a worthwhile trade-off. And the Roman navy, the classis, though less celebrated in popular imagination than the legions, played a crucial, often underestimated role. It patrolled the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and major rivers, protecting vital sea lanes, combating piracy, and most importantly, transporting troops, horses, and vast quantities of material for large-scale campaigns, particularly those across the sea or along major riverine frontiers. Without this sophisticated, multi-layered logistical tale, the long-term deployment of legions on distant frontiers, or the undertaking of protracted offensive campaigns in challenging environments like Dacia or Parthia, would have been simply impossible. The Roman military was not just a fighting force, it was a marvel of organization and supply. And so, for nearly 2 centuries, from the accession of Augustus in 27 BCE to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, largely held. It was an unprecedented era of relative internal tranquility, security, and prosperity across an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the moors of Scotland to the sands of the Sahara. Trade flourished along secure routes, cities grew in size and splendor, and a vibrant Greco-Roman culture blossomed and spread throughout the vast expanse of the empire. It sounds idyllic, doesn't it? A golden age. But this Roman peace, it must always be remembered, had its price, and its inherent contradictions. It was, in its essence, an imposed order, a peace maintained by the ever-present threat, and often the brutal application of Roman military force. It was a peace for those who accepted Roman rule, who paid their taxes, and who did not challenge the authority of Caesar. For those who dared to resist, the response was swift and often merciless. Uprisings, like that of the formidable Queen Boudicca and her Iceni warriors in Britain, who burned Roman cities to the ground before being savagely crushed, or the recurring, desperate Jewish wars in Judea, which culminated in the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem and the dispersal of much of its population, were stark reminders of the iron fist within the velvet glove of Roman administration. The peace was for the compliant, for the rebellious, there was only the sword. And the enormous cost of maintaining this vast army, this intricate bureaucracy, and these monumental public works fell largely upon the provinces, whose resources and manpower fueled the imperial machine. The professional imperial army, while the guarantor of this peace and the instrument of imperial power, also began to evolve into a significant, and sometimes problematic, political player in its own right. Stationed for long periods far from the political center of Rome, their daily lives, their careers, their very livelihoods intimately tied to the military hierarchy and, increasingly, to their immediate commanders, legions would, with alarming frequency in later, more troubled centuries, develop a powerful sense of corporate identity and, at times, a dangerous degree of political influence. Successful and popular generals, particularly those who led their troops to victory and distributed generous donatives, could command an almost fanatical loyalty. And when the imperial succession was disputed, or when a weak or unpopular emperor sat on the throne, these frontier armies, these powerful kingmakers, would often take matters into their own hands, proclaiming their own general as emperor. The Year of the Four Emperors, in 69 CE, following the death of Nero, was an early, bloody taste of this phenomenon, a chaotic scramble for power where legion backed legion, and the fate of the empire was decided not in the Senate House, but on the battlefield by Roman swords turned against Roman brothers. The very instrument designed by Augustus to ensure stability could, under certain circumstances, become the greatest threat to it. Furthermore, the ever-present need for manpower for this vast military machine led to a growing reliance on recruitment from the provinces, and, over time, increasingly from peoples living on, or even beyond the frontiers, the barbari, as the Romans often dismissively termed them. While this addressed immediate manpower shortages and brought valuable martial skills into the army, it also gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, began to alter the ethnic and cultural composition of the Roman military. The legions and auxiliary units became less Italian, less traditionally Roman, in their makeup, while these provincial and barbarian recruits were generally loyal and effective soldiers, thoroughly integrated into the Roman military system. This barbarization of the army would, in the much later empire, contribute to complex shifts in military identity, loyalty, and cohesion with profound long-term consequences. The borders of this vast empire, patrolled by these ever-evolving legions and auxilia, however, were never truly, entirely quiet. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, beyond the deserts of the East, lay a world the Romans often viewed with a mixture of contempt, fear, and sometimes grudging respect: the barbarian world. This was not a monolithic entity, but a constantly shifting mosaic of restless tribes, nomadic peoples, and, in the East, sophisticated rival empires. And it was here, on these far-flung, often inhospitable frontiers, that the legions were constantly tested, their mettle proven, their blood spilled, in an unending series of wars, skirmishes, and policing actions that, while perhaps less famous than the grand civil wars or the Punic conflicts, were absolutely vital to the survival and stability of the Pax Romana. The peace within was bought by constant vigilance, and often by brutal warfare without. Part 3. The storm gathers, crisis and transformation, 284 CE 4766 C. The Pax Romana, that long, golden summer of Roman dominance, an era that had seemed to stretch into an almost eternal present, could not, in the immutable calculus of history, last forever. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, the vast, imposing edifice of the Roman Empire, once seemingly unshakable, began to betray the strains of its immense age and colossal reach. The cracks, at first almost imperceptible, started to widen, spider webbing across its political, economic, and social foundations. And from beyond its heavily fortified frontiers, those impressive symbols of Roman order and control, new, more formidable, and increasingly desperate pressures were building. The world outside Rome's carefully curated limes was in flux, a cauldron of shifting allegiances, emerging confederations, and vast, unseen migrations. Great movements of peoples, vast human tides driven by forces we can only partially reconstruct from the fragmented whispers of archaeology and the biased accounts of Roman historians, began to press relentlessly against the empire's northern and eastern boundaries. Perhaps it was the inexorable creep of climatic change, altering traditional grazing lands and agricultural patterns, pushing entire populations in search of new sustenance. Perhaps it was the domino effect of other, even larger, nomadic movements originating from the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia, a chain reaction of displacement and conflict rippling outwards. And certainly, by the latter half of the 4th century, it was the terrifying, almost supernatural, advance of the Huns, those nomadic horsemen of unparalleled ferocity, whose westward surge sent shockwaves of panic through the Germanic and Gothic tribes who stood in their path. These were the peoples the Romans, with their characteristic blend of ingrained cultural arrogance and a deep-seated, almost primal apprehension of the other, often lumped together under the single, dismissive, and dangerously simplistic terms: barbarians. Goths, Visigoths and Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, Burgundians, Suebi, Saxe-Angles, Jutes, and a host of other, often ill-defined, tribal confederations. No longer were they merely disparate, easily managed local tribes content to be played off against one another or pacified by a swift punitive expedition. They were, increasingly, nations on the move, entire peoples uprooted, sometimes desperately seeking refuge and land within the perceived safety and relative prosperity of the Roman world, sometimes aggressively seeking plunder and new territories to call their own, sometimes simply fleeing even greater terrors advancing from their rear. The Roman frontiers, those impressive lines of forts, walls, watchtowers, and legionary bases that had for centuries demarcated the Orbis Romanus, the Roman world, from the Barbaricum beyond, now began to feel less like unbreachable ramparts and more like overburdened dikes straining against a relentlessly rising, chaotic flood. The pressure was immense, multifaceted, and almost constant, a war of 1,000 cuts rather than a single, decisive blow. Raids, once sporadic and localized, became more frequent, more daring, penetrating deeper and deeper into the once secure Roman provinces, disrupting agriculture, terrorizing populations, and stretching the empire's military resources to their breaking point. This period, particularly the 50-year span from roughly 235 to 284 CE, would later be dubbed by historians the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a time of almost unimaginable turmoil, a perfect storm of interlocking calamities that nearly tore the empire apart from within, even as the external threats mounted. near-constant civil war raged as ambitious generals, commanding legions whose loyalty was often to their commander rather than to the distant and often ephemeral emperor in Rome, vied for the purple. Usurpers rose and fell with bewildering rapidity. In one particularly chaotic year, no fewer than 6 men claimed the imperial title. The economy, crippled by debased coinage, runaway inflation, disrupted trade routes, and the crushing burden of military expenditure, teetered on the brink of collapse. Plague, a recurring scourge, swept through the empire, decimating populations and further weakening its ability to resist. It was against this backdrop of internal decay and systemic crisis that the barbarian pressures on the frontiers became not just a nuisance, but an existential threat. How did Rome, this aging titan, respond to this escalating, multi-front crisis? The traditional legions, the backbone of Roman military power for centuries, though still formidable when well led and properly supplied, were themselves showing signs of strain. They were stretched perilously thin across thousands of miles of frontier, often bogged down in the endless internal power struggles as their commanders made bids for the imperial throne or committed to defending one threatened sector while another erupted in flames. Manpower, the lifeblood of any army, became a constant, gnawing problem. The pool of traditional Roman and Italian recruits was shrinking, and the loyalty of provincial troops could be fickle. And so, Rome, in its characteristic, often brutal and unashamedly pragmatic fashion, began to adopt new strategies, new ways of managing, and often incorporating these barbarian peoples into its military and, sometimes, even its political orbit. This was not always, or even primarily, a matter of outright conquest and subjugation, as had been the dominant paradigm in earlier, more confident centuries. Increasingly, it became a complex, often uneasy, and frequently treacherous dance of diplomacy, subsidy, polite Roman term for what was often outright bribery or protection money, and co-option. Treaties were made, alliances forged, and often, just as quickly, broken. One of the most significant, and ultimately most consequential, developments of this period was the increasing reliance on foederati. These were, in essence, barbarian tribes, sometimes entire nations or substantial confederations, who were formally allied with Rome by treaty foedis. Under the terms of these agreements, they were often allowed to settle within Roman territory, sometimes on depopulated agricultural lands, which Rome lacked the manpower to cultivate, or in strategically important frontier zones. In exchange for this land, and often for regular payments in gold or supplies, these foederati were obligated to provide warriors, sometimes substantial contingents, to fight for the Roman army when called upon. On paper, and in the short term, this system often seemed like a sensible, even ingenious, solution to Rome's pressing military needs. Rome gained access to much-needed manpower, often warriors who were highly skilled in forms of warfare where the traditional Roman legionary was perhaps less adept, such as heavy shock cavalry or mobile light infantry tactics. These foederati would typically fight under the command of their own chieftains or kings, often maintaining their own distinctive customs, weaponry, and fighting styles, though nominally they were under the overall strategic direction of Roman generals. They were, in essence, allied barbarian armies fighting on behalf of Rome, a seemingly cost-effective way to bolster the empire's defenses. But this policy, born of dire necessity and a pragmatic calculation of risk and reward, was a double-edged sword, a dangerous gamble whose long-term consequences would prove devastating, particularly for the increasingly fragile Western Roman Empire. While these foederati contingents could be, and often were, effective and valiant soldiers on the battlefield when Roman interests aligned with their own, their loyalty was often conditional and frequently tenuous. Their primary allegiance was almost invariably to their own leaders, their own kinsmen, their own tribal identity, rather than to the abstract concept of the Roman state or to a distant, often alien, emperor in Ravenna or Rome. They fought for pay, for plunder, for the promise of land, and for the security and advancement of their own people. When Roman authority weakened, when imperial coffers ran dry and subsidies were not forthcoming, or when Roman promises were perceived to have been broken, these heavily armed, semi-autonomous barbarian groups, now firmly established within the empire's borders, could and often did pursue their own independent agendas. They could become a source of profound instability, a fifth column, rather than a bulwark of imperial defense. The lines between Roman soldier and barbarian mercenary, between trusted ally and potential enemy, became increasingly, perilously blurred. This barbarization of the Roman military was not limited to these formally allied foederati contingents. The regular Roman army itself, the legions and auxilia, began to recruit more and more heavily from Germanic, Gothic, Sarmatian, and other so-called barbarian peoples living along or just beyond the frontiers. For many of these individuals, Roman military service offered a path to a steady income, social advancement, and eventually, the still coveted prize of Roman citizenship. And Rome, desperate for recruits, was often willing to overlook ethnic origins in favor of martial prowess. But as the proportion of these non-Roman soldiers grew, the very character of the legions began to subtly, but inexorably, change. While these soldiers were generally integrated into the Roman military discipline, structure, and command hierarchy, they inevitably brought with them their own fighting styles, their own cultural sensibilities, and sometimes their own distinct loyalties. Roman military equipment itself began to adapt, reflecting both the changing nature of warfare and the origins of its recruits. The traditional short-stabbing sword, the gladius, which had served the legions so well for centuries in close, quarter infantry combat, was gradually replaced by the longer slashing sword, the spatha, a weapon more suited to cavalry and perhaps more familiar to Germanic warriors. The iconic rectangular shield, the scutum, gave way to round or oval shields. There was an increased emphasis on cavalry, both heavy shock cavalry and lighter missile cavalry, and on specialized missile troops like archers, reflecting the need to counter the highly mobile tactics of many of Rome's new adversaries. The traditional image of the Roman legionary, the heavily armored, disciplined citizen, soldier of the Republic and early empire, the master of the pilum and the gladius, was slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, fading, being replaced by a more diverse, more barbarized, fighting man. This was not necessarily, it must be stressed, an immediate or universal decline in fighting quality. Many of these, barbarian, recruits were fierce, capable, and highly skilled warriors, often hailing from cultures with strong martial traditions. When well led, well paid, and properly supplied, they could fight with great courage and effectiveness for Rome. Indeed, some of the most capable Roman generals of the later empire would themselves be of barbarian or mixed descent. But it did represent a fundamental and ultimately destabilizing shift in the relationship between the army and the Roman state, particularly in the chronically under-resourced and politically fragmented western half of the empire. The army became less an organic expression of Roman civic identity and shared purpose, and more a collection of professional, often ethnically distinct, war bands whose loyalty could be bought, swayed, or, most dangerously, transferred to a charismatic commander who promised greater rewards or catered to their specific interests. The very fabric of Roman military tradition, painstakingly woven over centuries, was now being rewoven with predominantly foreign threads, creating a tapestry of new strengths, but also new, and ultimately fatal, vulnerabilities. The great barbarian invasions, therefore, as they are often dramatically portrayed, were not a simple, monolithic, coordinated assault on a unified and resolute Roman Empire. The reality was far more complex, more protracted, and more multifaceted. It was a long, drawn-out process, a series of distinct but often overlapping migrations. Opportunistic raids by war, bands large and small, formal settlements by treaty, which often broke down into renewed conflict, and, eventually, outright conquests of Roman territory. These movements were driven by a diverse array of pressures and ambitions, from the search for new lands and a better life, to the flight from more powerful enemies, to the simple desire for plunder and prestige, and critically, the success or perceived success of these barbarian incursions was often facilitated, even invited, by Rome's own profound and persistent internal weaknesses. Recurrent and bloody civil wars frequently stripped the frontiers of their best troops, as rival claimants to the imperial throne marched their armies against each other rather than against external foes. Crippling economic crises, fueled by debased currency, rampant inflation, and disrupted production and trade, made it increasingly difficult for the state to pay, equip, and supply its armies adequately, leading to mutinies and a decline in morale. Endemic political instability, with emperors rising and falling with alarming frequency, undermined any possibility of a coherent, consistent, long-term strategic response to the mounting external pressures. The barbarians were not so much a single, overwhelming, irresistible force, but rather a complex constellation of diverse pressures and peoples who were adept at exploiting the widening cracks, the political vacuums, and the military overstretch within an already strained and increasingly fragmented imperial structure. The storm, which had been gathering on the horizon for decades, even centuries, was now truly breaking. The very foundations of Roman military power, the legions and the system that supported them, were being tested as never before. The critical question was no longer just about defending the far-flung frontiers of a vast empire, but about whether the empire itself, particularly in its chronically troubled western half, possessed the internal cohesion, the resources, and the political will to adapt, to reform, and ultimately, to survive in this new, more dangerous, and unforgiving world. The old certainties were crumbling, and the future of Rome hung precariously in the balance. The Roman Empire, by the close of the 3rd century, was an aging giant, battered by decades of internal strife and relentless external pressure. The crisis of the 3rd century had shaken it to its very core, leaving it fragile, impoverished, and perilously close to complete disintegration. It was clear to any astute observer that the old ways, the systems and structures that had served Rome so well for centuries, were no longer adequate to meet the challenges of this new, more brutal age. Without drastic, even revolutionary, change, the empire seemed doomed to collapse under the weight of its own accumulated problems and the ever-increasing barbarian incursions. And in this moment of profound crisis, strong, capable leaders did emerge. Men of iron will and pragmatic vision who attempted to drag the lumbering Roman state back from the brink. The first, and perhaps most significant, of these was Diocletian, an experienced soldier of humble Balkan origins who rose through the ranks to seize the imperial purple in 284 CE. Diocletian was no idealistic dreamer, he was a hard-headed realist who understood that the empire, in its current form, was simply too vast, too unwieldy, to be governed effectively by a single man, especially in an age of constant, multi-front warfare. His solution was called the tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He divided the empire into an eastern and western half, each to be ruled by a senior emperor, an Augustus, who would in turn appoint a junior emperor, a Caesar, as his deputy and designated successor. This was not a formal division of the empire into 2 separate states, at least not yet, but rather an attempt to create a more responsive and stable system of command, with an emperor closer to each major threatened frontier. Diocletian himself took the wealthier, more strategically vital eastern half, establishing his capital not in Rome, but in Nicomedia in Asia Minor, a clear recognition of the shifting center of gravity within the empire. But administrative reform was only part of Diocletian's grand plan. He also recognized the urgent need to overhaul the Roman military, which had proven increasingly ineffective during the preceding decades of chaos. The army was significantly enlarged, perhaps even doubled in size by some estimates, placing an enormous new strain on the already beleaguered imperial treasury. More fundamentally, its structure and deployment were rethought. Diocletian, and later his successor Constantine, effectively created a 2-tiered military system. The first tier consisted of the limitani or riparienses, frontier troops, essentially a border guard militia. These soldiers were often local recruits, settled on plots of land along the frontiers, and tasked with holding the first line of defense, manning the forts and watchtowers, and dealing with minor incursions. They were, in a sense, farmer soldiers, less mobile and perhaps less well-equipped than the elite field armies, but providing a permanent, if sometimes thin, screen along the empire's vast perimeter. The second, and more crucial, tier was the comitatenses, the mobile field army. These were elite, heavily armed, and highly mobile units, often including a significant proportion of cavalry, designed to act as a strategic reserve. Instead of being permanently tied to a specific frontier, the comitatenses were kept further back, often accompanying the emperors or their senior generals, ready to be dispatched rapidly to any threatened sector to confront major barbarian invasions or to deal with internal rebellions. Within the comitatenses, there were even more elite units, the palatini, who formed the imperial bodyguard and a core strike force. This shift from a primarily static, frontier-based defense to a defense, in-depth strategy, relying on a combination of border guards and mobile field armies, was a logical response to the changing nature of the threats Rome faced. No longer could the empire hope to maintain an impenetrable wall along its entire border. The frontiers were becoming increasingly porous, and the barbarian enemies were often too numerous, too mobile, and too unpredictable to be contained by fixed fortifications alone. The comitatances provided the necessary flexibility to react to major breakthroughs and to concentrate force where it was most needed. Constantine the Great, who emerged as sole emperor after another round of bloody civil wars following Diocletian's abdication, largely continued and refined these military reforms. He further increased the size and importance of the mobile field armies, and, significantly, he moved the capital of the empire definitively to the east, founding the magnificent new city of Constantinople on the site of the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium. This strategic location, controlling the vital straits between Europe and Asia, and far more defensible than Rome, would become the heart of Roman power for another 1,000 years, long after the western half had crumbled. These reforms by Diocletian and Constantine undoubtedly brought a measure of stability and renewed strength to the empire. They ended the worst excesses of the 3rd century crisis and allowed Rome to weather the storms of the 4th century with a degree of success. But they also came at a tremendous cost. The vastly increased size of the army and the bureaucracy needed to support it placed an almost unbearable burden on the imperial economy, leading to higher taxes, more debased coinage, and increasingly oppressive state control over many aspects of life. And the barbarization of the army continued, even accelerated, as more and more Germanic and other non-Roman peoples were recruited into both the Limitani and the elite comitatances. Many of the most effective units in the late Roman army were composed primarily of, or led by, men of barbarian origin. While often fiercely loyal to their paymasters and their comrades in arms, their ultimate connection to the traditional Roman state and its ideals was becoming increasingly tenuous. The new defensive strategy, while logical, also had its drawbacks. The Limitani, often poorly paid and equipped, could sometimes prove ineffective against determined barbarian incursions, and the mobile field armies, the comitatances, could not be everywhere at once. If a major barbarian force broke through the frontier, while the field army was engaged elsewhere, or if the field army itself was defeated in a major battle, vast swaths of provincial territory could be left exposed to devastation. And defeat in a major battle was an ever-present and increasingly frequent reality. The 4th century witnessed a series of devastating clashes between Roman armies and various Gothic and Germanic confederations, clashes that exposed the growing vulnerabilities of the Roman military machine. One of the most catastrophic of these was the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. The Visigoths, fleeing the relentless advance of the Huns from the east, had been allowed to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory in Thrace, under a treaty that quickly broke down due to Roman mismanagement and exploitation. Starving and desperate, the Goths rose in rebellion. The Eastern Roman Emperor, Valens, confident in the strength of his legions and perhaps eager for a decisive victory, marched against them without waiting for reinforcements from the Western Emperor, Gratian. The result was an unmitigated disaster for Rome, a defeat that some historians rank alongside Cannae and Teutoburg Forest in its psychological and strategic impact. Near the city of Adrianople, the Roman legions, perhaps tired and disorganized after a long march in the summer heat, were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by the Gothic heavy cavalry, supported by their infantry. The Roman lines broke, and what followed was a massacre. Emperor Valens himself was killed, along with 2/3 of his army, including many of its most experienced officers and veteran units. Adrianople was a shattering blow. It demonstrated, in the most brutal fashion, that the once invincible Roman legions were no longer masters of every battlefield. It highlighted the growing importance of heavy cavalry, a type of warfare in which many Germanic peoples excelled. And, perhaps most significantly, it left a large, victorious, and understandably hostile Gothic army firmly entrenched within the empire's borders, a problem that Rome would struggle to manage for decades to come. the battle forced a fundamental reassessment of Roman military tactics and an even greater reliance on Germanic allies and recruits to fill the depleted ranks. The Goths, after Adrianople, could no longer be easily dismissed or dictated to. They had become a major, independent power broker within the Roman world. In the decades that followed Adrianople, the Western Roman Empire, in particular, entered a period of accelerating decline, a downward spiral of political instability, economic weakness, and relentless barbarian pressure. The imperial throne in the West became a precarious perch, often occupied by weak or short-lived emperors who were little more than puppets in the hands of powerful military strongmen, many of whom were themselves of barbarian origin. Figures like Stilicho, a Vandal by birth who rose to become the Magister Militum, the supreme military commander of the Western Empire in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, embodied this complex and often contradictory reality. Stilicho was a brilliant general, a master of diplomacy and intrigue, who fought tirelessly and often successfully to defend Italy and the western provinces against a bewildering array of threats: Visigoths under Alaric, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Suebi, Alans. He cobbled together armies from Roman remnants and barbarian foederati, winning remarkable victories against overwhelming odds. For a time, he seemed to be the indispensable man, the only figure capable of holding the crumbling Western Empire together. Yet, Stilicho's very success and his barbarian heritage made him an object of suspicion and jealousy among the Roman senatorial aristocracy and the often paranoid imperial court in Ravenna. He was accused of treason, of plotting to place his own son on the throne, and in 408 CE, he was betrayed and executed. With his death, the West lost its most capable defender, and the floodgates of barbarian invasion opened wider. Just 2 years later, in 410 CE, an event occurred that sent shockwaves of disbelief and despair throughout the Roman world, an event that symbolized, perhaps more than any other, the irreversible decline of Roman power in the West. Rome, the eternal city, the once unconquered heart of the empire, was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. For 3 days, the Goths plundered the city, though Alaric, a Christian, reportedly ordered his men to spare the churches and to refrain from widespread massacre. But the psychological impact was profound. The inviolability of Rome, a cornerstone of Roman identity for 8 centuries, had been shattered. If Rome itself could fall, what hope was there for the rest of the Western Empire? The 5th century saw the Western Empire progressively disintegrate. Britain was abandoned by the legions around 410 CE, left to fend for itself against Saxon, Anglo, and Jute invaders. Gaul was overrun by Franks, Burgundians, and Visigoths, who carved out their own independent kingdoms on Roman soil. Spain was similarly lost to Vandals, Suebi, and Alans, and North Africa, the breadbasket of Rome, fell to the Vandals under their audacious king, Gaiseric, who then used their newfound naval power to launch devastating pirate raids across the Mediterranean, culminating in a second, more brutal, sack of Rome in 455 CE. Amidst this accelerating collapse, there were still moments of Roman resistance, brief flickers of the old imperial spirit. Flavius Aetius, another powerful magister militum of mixed Roman and barbarian Scythian descent, often called the last of the Romans, managed to forge a fragile coalition of Roman forces and Visigothic foederati to confront the most terrifying barbarian threat of all, Attila the Hun, at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, also known as Châtellons, in 451 CE. In a vast and bloody confrontation involving hundreds of thousands of warriors, Aetius and his allies fought Attila's Hunnic Empire to a standstill, effectively halting the Hunnic advance into Western Europe. It was a momentous victory, a testament to Aetius's skill and the enduring, if diminished, fighting capacity of the late Roman military. But even Aetius could not reverse the tide of disintegration. Like Stilicho before him, his power and success bred jealousy, and he too was assassinated in 454 CE by the very emperor he served, Valentinian III. With his death, the last truly effective military leader of the Western Empire was gone. The remaining decades of the Western Roman Empire were a grim spectacle of puppet emperors, often raised and deposed at will by powerful Germanic military commanders who held the real authority. Figures like Ricimer, a Suebi or Goth, became the ultimate kingmaker, controlling the Western throne from behind the scenes for nearly 2 decades, appointing and discarding emperors as he saw fit. The Western Empire was now Roman in name only, its territories lost, its armies predominantly barbarian, its emperors shadowy, powerless figures. The very concept of a unified Roman state in the West was becoming a fading memory. The traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 CE. In that year, Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain of Syrian or Rugian descent, who commanded the Foederati troops in Italy, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. But Odoacer did not, as previous kingmakers had done, simply install another puppet emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial insignia, the symbols of Western Roman authority, to Zeno, the Eastern Roman emperor in Constantinople, effectively declaring that there was no longer a need for a separate emperor in the West. He then proceeded to rule Italy as a king under the nominal authority of Constantinople. Was this, then, the fall? In many ways, 476 CE was less a cataclysmic event and more a whimper, the almost inevitable culmination of a long, slow process of political, economic, social, and military decay that had been underway for centuries. For the people living in Italy at the time, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus probably changed very little in their daily lives. Roman administration, Roman law, and Roman culture continued, albeit in an increasingly localized and fragmented form, under the rule of Odoacer and the Germanic successor kingdoms that were now firmly established across what had once been the Western Roman Empire. But from a military perspective, the fall of the West represented the final failure of the Roman military machine in that half of the empire to perform its primary function to defend Roman territory and maintain Roman authority. The reasons for this failure were manifold and complex. The sheer scale of the frontiers, stretching for thousands of miles, had always been a challenge, but in an age of mass migrations and multi-front pressures, it became an impossible burden for an empire whose resources, particularly manpower and revenue, were dwindling. The over-reliance on foederati and barbarian recruits, while a necessary evil in the short term, ultimately undermined Roman military cohesion and loyalty, creating armies that were often more loyal to their immediate paymasters or their own ethnic leaders than to the Roman state. Endemic civil war and political instability diverted precious resources and a dark tension away from frontier defense, as Roman armies were repeatedly called upon to fight other Roman armies in struggles for imperial power. Economic decline, fueled by inflation, oppressive taxation, and the disruption of trade and agriculture, crippled the state's ability to adequately fund its military. And perhaps there was also a deeper, less tangible, decline in what might be called Romanitas, that sense of shared civic identity, purpose, and willingness to sacrifice for the res publica that had been such a powerful motivating force in earlier centuries. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on the magnificent and highly defensible new capital of Constantinople, with its generally more stable political institutions, its more resilient economy, and its more easily defended frontiers, would survive, and indeed thrive, for another 1,000 years, preserving and transforming the Roman military legacy in its own unique way. But in the West, the great eagle had finally, definitively, fallen. Its vast territories were now fragmented into a mosaic of Germanic kingdoms: Visigoths in Spain and southern Gaul, Ostrogoths in Italy, Franks in northern Gaul, Vandals in Africa, Anglo-Saxons in Britain. The political unity of the Western Roman world was shattered. Yet, even in its collapse, the military legacy of Rome in the West was not entirely extinguished. The Germanic successor kingdoms often adopted and adapted Roman military titles, organization, and even some tactical concepts. Roman roads, Roman fortifications, and Roman military treatises continued to influence warfare in Europe for centuries to come, and the very idea of a unified, Christian Roman Empire, even if only a distant memory or an idealized aspiration, would continue to haunt the political imagination of Europe throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. The storm had passed, leaving a landscape irrevocably altered. But the story of Roman arms, the story of that extraordinary military tradition, was not yet entirely over. Its next chapter would unfold in the East, in the enduring city of Constantine. Part 4. The Eastern Roman Legacy. The West had fallen. Its provinces were now barbarian kingdoms, its imperial symbols sent eastward to Constantinople, the new Rome, the magnificent city founded by Constantine the Great on the strategic shores of the Bosphorus, while Italy, Gaul, and Spain descended into what many later termed a Dark Age. The Roman Empire in the East not only survived but entered a period of renewed vigor and ambition. This was not yet commonly called Byzantium. By its contemporaries, to them, they were simply Romioi, Romans, the legitimate and unbroken continuation of the ancient Roman state. And in the 6th century, under one of its most formidable and controversial emperors, Justinian I, this Eastern Roman Empire would embark on a breathtaking, almost reckless, attempt to reclaim its lost Western heritage. Justinian, who ascended the throne in 527 CE, was a man of boundless energy, profound piety, and an unshakable belief in Rome's universal destiny. He was a tireless administrator, a monumental builder, the Hagia Sophia. His magnificent cathedral in Constantinople still stands as a testament to his vision and a codifier of Roman law, whose corpus juris civilis would form the basis of legal systems across Europe for centuries. But his grandest, and ultimately most costly, ambition was the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the renewal of the Roman Empire, the reconquest of the lost western provinces from their Germanic rulers. To achieve this audacious goal, Justinian needed not only immense financial resources, which he often ruthlessly extracted from his populace, but also generals of exceptional skill and armies capable of projecting Roman power across the Mediterranean once more. And in Flavius Belisarius, he found his Caesar, his Scipio. Belisarius was a military genius of the first order, a commander renowned for his tactical brilliance, his ability to inspire his troops, and his remarkable capacity for winning victories even when heavily outnumbered. The first target of Justinian's reconquest was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. The Vandals, who had seized this vital Roman province in the previous century, had established a powerful, though often fractious, state and had become a notorious pirate menace in the Mediterranean. In 533 CE, Belisarius, with a relatively small expeditionary force of around 15,000 men, landed in Africa. The Vandals, caught by surprise and perhaps grown complacent, were decisively defeated in 2 key battles, Ad Decimum and Trichomarum. Their king, Gelimer, was captured, and the entire Vandal kingdom collapsed with astonishing speed. North Africa, with its rich grain supplies and strategic ports, was restored to Roman rule. It was a stunning triumph, a seemingly auspicious start to Justinian's grand design. Emboldened by this swift success, Justinian next turned his attention to Italy, now ruled by the Ostrogoths. The Ostrogoths, under their great king Theodoric, had initially governed Italy with a degree of stability and even a respect for Roman institutions. But Theodoric's successors were weaker, and internal divisions within the Ostrogothic kingdom provided Justinian with a pretext for intervention. In 535 CE, Belisarius landed in Sicily, which quickly fell, and then crossed into mainland Italy. What followed, however, was not a swift repeat of the African campaign. The Gothic War in Italy would become a brutal, protracted, and devastating conflict, lasting for nearly 2 decades, from 535 to 554 CE. The Ostrogoths, though often poorly led and internally divided, proved to be far more resilient and formidable opponents than the Vandals. Belisarius, often starved of adequate reinforcements and resources by a suspicious and sometimes parsimonious Justinian, waged a brilliant but exhausting campaign. He captured Naples, then Rome itself, which he successfully defended against a massive Gothic siege. He took Ravenna, the Ostrogothic capital, and even captured the Gothic king, Witiges. It seemed, for a moment, that Italy too was on the verge of being fully restored to the empire. But the Goths were not yet broken. Under a dynamic new leader, Totila, they rallied, launching a devastating counter-offensive that recaptured much of Italy, including Rome, which changed hands several times during this bloody struggle. The war descended into a grim cycle of sieges, skirmishes, and widespread devastation, leaving much of the Italian peninsula in ruins, its population decimated, its ancient infrastructure crumbling. Belisarius, recalled and then sent back to Italy with insufficient forces, struggled to contain the Gothic resurgence. Eventually, Justinian, perhaps losing patience or growing wary of Belisarius's immense popularity, replaced him with another general, the eunuch Narses. Narses, though an unlikely military commander, proved to be a capable and ruthless strategist. Given more substantial resources, he finally managed to crush the remaining Ostrogothic resistance in a series of decisive battles, most notably at Taginae in 552 CE, where Totila was killed. By 554 CE, Italy was, at last, nominally back under imperial control. Justinian had also managed to reclaim a small part of southeastern Spain from the Visigoths. On the surface, Justinian's Renovatio Imperii seemed a remarkable success. The Mediterranean once again appeared to be a Roman lake. But the cost had been staggering. The decades of warfare had drained the imperial treasury, exhausted its manpower, and left the newly reconquered western provinces, particularly Italy, shattered and depopulated. And these hard-won gains would prove to be tragically ephemeral. The empire, overstretched and weakened, found itself unable to effectively defend these distant territories against new waves of invaders. Within a few years of Justinian's death, the Lombards, another Germanic people, would invade and conquer much of Italy, leaving only Ravenna, Rome, and parts of the south in Byzantine hands. The dream of a fully restored Western Roman Empire had been a fleeting, bloody illusion. Furthermore, while Justinian's gaze was fixed firmly on the west, an even older and more persistent threat loomed on the eastern frontier, the Sasanian Empire of Persia. For centuries, Rome and Persia had been locked in an almost perpetual state of rivalry, a grand geopolitical struggle for dominance in the Near East. This was a clash of titans, two highly sophisticated, ancient civilizations with well-organized armies and deeply entrenched imperial ambitions. The eastern frontier, stretching from the mountains of Armenia through the plains of Mesopotamia to the deserts of Syria, was a constant battleground, marked by sieges of fortified cities, devastating raids deep into enemy territory, and occasional, though rarely decisive, large-scale field battles. Justinian himself waged several costly and largely inconclusive wars against the Sasanian king, Khosrow Anushirvan, a ruler of comparable ambition and ability. These conflicts, while often overshadowed in Western historiography by the Gothic and Vandal wars, were a constant drain on Byzantine resources and manpower, diverting troops and attention that might otherwise have been used to consolidate the gains in the West or to deal with emerging threats in the Balkans. The strategic dilemma facing Byzantine emperors was immense: how to defend a vast empire with multiple active fronts against a variety of formidable enemies, with resources that were, despite the empire's wealth, ultimately finite. The Balkans, for instance, were becoming increasingly vulnerable to incursions by Slavic peoples, who began to migrate southwards across the Danube in large numbers, and by nomadic Avar horsemen, who posed a significant military threat. And then, as if the burdens of constant warfare were not enough, a cataclysm of a different kind struck the empire during Justinian's reign, the Great Plague of 541-542 CE, often known as the Plague of Justinian. This devastating pandemic, likely the first recorded instance of bubonic plague, swept through the Mediterranean world, killing millions, perhaps as much as a third or even half of the population in some areas. The demographic and economic consequences were catastrophic, further weakening the empire's ability to recruit soldiers, collect taxes, and maintain its vast administrative and military apparatus. Procopius, the contemporary historian who chronicled Justinian's wars and also witnessed the plague firsthand in Constantinople, left a horrifying account of its relentless, indiscriminate devastation. Thus, the legacy of Justinian's reign, while marked by moments of dazzling military success and monumental cultural achievement, was also deeply ambiguous. His dream of restoring the full glory of the Roman Empire, while partially realized, proved to be unsustainable and came at a terrible price, leaving the empire overstretched, financially depleted, and demographically weakened. The stage was set for even greater challenges in the century to come. As the 6th century gave way to the 7th, the long simmering conflict with Sasanian Persia erupted into its final, most devastating, and ultimately self-destructive phase. This last great war of antiquity, lasting from 6U2 to 6E28 CE, would push both empires to the very brink of annihilation and, in doing so, would inadvertently pave the way for an entirely new, unforeseen, and world-changing force to emerge from the deserts of Arabia. The war began with the overthrow and murder of the Byzantine Emperor Maurice by a usurper named Phocas. Khosrow Siku, the Sasanian king, who had previously been aided by Maurice in regaining his own throne, used Maurice's murder as a pretext to launch a full-scale invasion of the Byzantine Empire, ostensibly to avenge his former benefactor. The initial Sasanian onslaught was terrifyingly successful. Byzantine defenses, weakened by internal strife under the brutal and incompetent rule of Phocas, crumbled. Sasanian armies overran Syria, capturing Antioch and Damascus. They then pushed into Palestine, and in 6014 CE, in a particularly shocking blow to Christian morale, they captured Jerusalem, sacking the holy city and carrying off the true cross, one of Christendom's most sacred relics, to their capital at Ctesiphon. Egypt, the granary of the empire, fell next. Sasanian forces even reached Chalcedon, directly across the Bosphorus from Constantinople itself, their campfires visible from the walls of the imperial capital. It seemed as though the Eastern Roman Empire was on the verge of complete collapse, its centuries-long struggle with Persia about to end in Persian triumph. But in this darkest hour, another remarkable figure rose to prominence: Heraclius. The son of the Exarch of Africa, Heraclius sailed to Constantinople in 610 CE, overthrew the hated Phocas, and assumed the imperial purple. For the first decade of his reign, Heraclius faced an almost impossible situation, with the Sasanians holding vast swaths of imperial territory, and the Avars and Slavs pressing hard in the Balkans, even laying siege to Constantinople itself in concert with the Persians. But Heraclius was a man of extraordinary courage, deep religious conviction, and brilliant military acumen. Slowly, methodically, he reorganized the empire's remaining resources, rallied its spirits, and prepared for a desperate counter-offensive. In a series of daring and brilliantly executed campaigns, beginning in 622 CE, Heraclius took the audacious step of leading his armies deep into Sasanian territory itself, effectively taking the war to the enemy's heartland. He bypassed the main Sasanian forces occupying Byzantine lands and struck at their vulnerable rear, campaigning in Armenia and Mesopotamia. This was a high-stakes gamble, leaving Constantinople itself vulnerable, but it was a calculated risk designed to break the Sasanian will to fight. The climax of this epic struggle came in 626 CE, when a combined Sasanian, Avar force laid siege to Constantinople. But the city's formidable Theodosian walls, its determined defenders, and the crucial role of the Byzantine navy, which controlled the Bosphorus and prevented the Sasanian forces in Asia from linking up with the Avars in Europe, proved too much for the attackers. The siege was lifted, a massive psychological and strategic victory for Byzantium. Heraclius, meanwhile, continued his campaigns in the east, culminating in a decisive victory over the Sasanian army at the Battle of Nineveh in December 627 CE. This broke the back of Sasanian resistance. Khosrow was overthrown and murdered by his own son, Kavad II, who immediately sued for peace. The terms were a complete Byzantine triumph. All conquered territories were restored. Prisoners were exchanged, and the true cross was returned to Jerusalem. Heraclius returned to Constantinople in a magnificent triumphal procession, hailed as a new Scipio, a new Alexander. It seemed as though Byzantium had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, that its ancient rivalry with Persia had finally been settled in its favor. But the victory was a Pyrrhic one. Both empires, Byzantine and Sasanian alike, were utterly exhausted by the decades of relentless, all-consuming warfare. Their treasuries were empty, their armies depleted, their populations weary and ravaged. They had fought each other to a standstill, to the point of mutual prostration, and neither of them, in their moment of shared exhaustion, recognized the storm gathering on their southern flank. From the deserts of Arabia, a new, dynamic, and fiercely unified force, inspired by the nascent religion of Islam, was about to erupt onto the world stage. These Arab warriors, hardened by desert life and fired by religious zeal, would find two ancient, war-weary empires ripe for the taking. The long and bloody saga of Roman-Persian conflict had inadvertently set the stage for the rise of a new world power, a power that would fundamentally and permanently alter the geopolitical map of the Near East and the Mediterranean world. The legacy of Justinian's dream and Heraclius's desperate gamble was about to be tested by an entirely unforeseen and ultimately far more transformative challenge. Heraclius had returned to Constantinople a hero, the true cross restored, the ancient Persian foe humbled. It should have been a moment of lasting triumph, a new golden age for the Eastern Roman Empire. But history, as it so often does, had a cruel twist in store. The decades of all-consuming warfare between Byzantium and Persia, that epic, centuries-long struggle, had left both empires hollowed out, their treasuries depleted, their armies decimated, their populations exhausted and yearning for peace. They had fought each other to a standstill, to the point of mutual prostration. Blind to the storm that was gathering with astonishing speed on their southern flank, in the hitherto marginal lands of the Arabian Peninsula. For it was here, in the deserts of Arabia, that a new, dynamic, and fiercely unified force was erupting onto the world stage, inspired by the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and the nascent religion of Islam. United by a fervent faith and led by a series of brilliant and ruthless military commanders, the early caliphs and generals like Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Sword of Allah, these Arab warriors, hardened by the austerities of desert life and driven by a potent combination of religious zeal and a desire for conquest and its spoils, were about to explode out of their homeland. And they would find two ancient, war-weary empires, Byzantium and Persia, almost fatally unprepared for the sheer speed, ferocity, and strategic brilliance of their onslaught. The first blows fell upon the Sasanian Empire, which, crippled by its recent defeat at the hands of Heraclius and racked by internal dynastic struggles, collapsed with astonishing rapidity under the Arab advance. Within a few short years, the once mighty Persian Empire, Rome's rival for centuries, was no more, its territories absorbed into the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. Then, it was Byzantium's turn. The rich eastern provinces of Syria and Palestine, recently recovered by Heraclius from the Persians, were the first to feel the full force of the Arab armies. Byzantine defenses in the region, still being reorganized after the long Persian occupation and perhaps manned by troops whose loyalty was wavering or whose morale was low, proved woefully inadequate. The Arab commanders, employing highly mobile cavalry tactics perfectly suited to the desert and semi-arid terrain, consistently outmaneuvered and outfought the more ponderous Byzantine forces. A series of Byzantine defeats culminated in the disastrous Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE, fought near the Yarmouk River, a tributary of the Jordan. This was a massive, multi-day engagement where a large Byzantine army, perhaps hampered by internal divisions among its commanders and by the unfamiliar tactics of its opponents, was decisively crushed by the Arab forces under Khalid ibn al-Walid. Yarmouk was a catastrophe for Byzantium, a blow arguably as significant as Manzikert would be centuries later. It shattered Byzantine military power in the Levant and effectively sealed the fate of Syria and Palestine. Damascus fell, then Antioch, and in 638 CE, after a prolonged siege, Jerusalem itself surrendered to the Caliph Umar. The true cross, so recently restored by Heraclius, once again fell into non-Christian hands, though this time, under the terms of surrender, Christian holy sites were generally respected. The loss of these provinces, with their ancient cities, their substantial Christian populations, and their significant contributions to the imperial treasury, was a devastating blow to Byzantine prestige and power. But the Arab advance did not stop there. Egypt, the granary of the empire, a land of immense strategic and economic importance, was next. In 639 CE, an Arab army under Amr ibn al-As invaded Egypt. Byzantine resistance, weakened by internal religious divisions, particularly the ongoing conflict between Chalcedonian Orthodoxy and Monophysitism, and perhaps by a sense of fatalism after the disasters in Syria, was surprisingly ineffective. Alexandria, the great metropolis of the eastern Mediterranean, second only to Constantinople in size and importance, fell in 6042 CE after a lengthy siege. With Egypt gone, Byzantium lost not only a vital source of grain, which had fed Constantinople for centuries, but also a major naval base and a significant portion of its population and revenue. The tide of conquest seemed unstoppable. Arab armies swept across North Africa, the lands so recently and bloodily reconquered by Belisarius for Justinian. Carthage, the ancient Roman city, fell in 698 CE, effectively ending Byzantine rule in the region. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was rapidly becoming a contested zone, as the new Arab caliphates, particularly the Umayyads based in Damascus, quickly learned the arts of shipbuilding and naval warfare, challenging Byzantine maritime supremacy. They seized Cyprus, Rhodes, and Crete, using them as bases for raids against Byzantine coasts and shipping. Twice, during this period of seemingly relentless Arab expansion, the ultimate prize, Constantinople itself, the very heart of the Byzantine Empire, came under direct assault. The first great Arab siege of Constantinople lasted for 4 years, from 674 to 678 CE. A massive Umayyad fleet blockaded the city from the Sea of Marmara, while land forces threatened its European approaches. But the city's formidable triple line of Theodosian walls, its determined defenders, and crucially, a devastating secret weapon, proved too much for the attackers. This weapon was Greek fire, a highly combustible liquid compound, perhaps petroleum-based, that could be projected from siphons mounted on Byzantine warships, engulfing enemy vessels in an inferno that, according to contemporary accounts, could not be extinguished by water. Greek fire sowed terror among the Arab fleets and played a decisive role in repelling the siege. A second, even larger, Arab siege of Constantinople took place from 717 to 718 CE, led by Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik. This was a truly massive undertaking, involving perhaps as many as 200,000 men and a fleet of over 1,000 ships. The city was invested by land and sea, and its fate hung precariously in the balance. But once again, the combination of Constantinople's impregnable fortifications, the skillful leadership of the Byzantine emperor Leo III the Isaurians, founder of the Isaurian dynasty, the devastating effectiveness of Greek fire against the Arab fleet, a particularly harsh winter that caused severe hardship among the besiegers, and timely intervention by Bulgarian allies who attacked the Arab land forces from the rear, led to a catastrophic Arab defeat. The siege was lifted, with enormous losses for the attackers. The failure of these two great sieges of Constantinople were events of world, historical significance. Had Constantinople fallen in the 7th or 8th century, the path into southeastern Europe would have been open to the Arab caliphates, and the subsequent history of Europe, and indeed of Christendom, might have been vastly different. The successful defense of the city preserved the Byzantine Empire as a vital bulwark against Islamic expansion into Europe from the east for centuries to come. It was a testament to the enduring strength of Roman engineering, the innovative capacity of Byzantine military technology, and the sheer, desperate resilience of its people and leaders in the face of overwhelming odds. Despite these heroic defensive victories, the Byzantine Empire that emerged from this crucible of Arab conquests was a very different entity from the sprawling Mediterranean empire of Justinian. It had been shorn of its wealthiest eastern and southern provinces, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa. It was now a much smaller, more compact, and predominantly Greek-speaking state centered on Anatolia's Asia Minor, the Balkans, and its Italian possessions. Anatolia, in particular, became the new heartland of the empire, its rugged plateau providing a vital source of manpower for the Byzantine armies and a natural defensive barrier against further Arab incursions from the south and east. The relentless pressure from the Arab caliphates forced a fundamental reorganization of the Byzantine military and administrative system. The old Roman provincial structure, with its separation of civil and military authority, proved inadequate to meet the demands of constant, existential warfare. In its place, a new system gradually evolved, a system that would become the hallmark of Byzantine military organization for centuries, the theme system. This transformation, along with the development of new military tactics and technologies, would allow the embattled empire to survive, to adapt, and eventually, even to launch its own counter-offensives in the centuries to come. The Roman eagle, though battered and diminished, was not yet grounded. It was learning to fly in a new, more dangerous, and far more challenging sky. The loss of its richest eastern and southern provinces to the Arab caliphates in the 7th century was a devastating blow, a near-fatal amputation for the Byzantine Empire. It was a moment of profound crisis that could have easily heralded its complete collapse. Yet Byzantium did not collapse. Instead, in a testament to its extraordinary resilience and its enduring Roman heritage of adaptation, it transformed itself, forging a new military and administrative system that would not only ensure its survival, but would also lay the groundwork for a remarkable resurgence in the centuries to come. This was a period of profound, often desperate, innovation, where the old Roman ways were not simply discarded, but were re-evaluated, re-engineered, and fused with new ideas to meet the unprecedented challenges of a new era. At the heart of this transformation was the gradual development of the theme system. The old Roman provincial structure, with its clear, and often cumbersome, separation of civil and military authority, proved too slow, too inflexible, to deal with the constant threat of Arab raids and invasions across a now much reduced, but still extensive, frontier, particularly in Anatolia, the empire's new heartland. The theme system, which likely began to emerge in the mid-7th century, and was consolidated and expanded over the following centuries, effectively militarized the administration of these vital frontier provinces. Each thema, or theme, was essentially a military district, governed by a strategos, a military governor who wielded both civil and military authority within his territory. This unified command structure allowed for a much quicker and more decisive response to enemy incursions. But the true genius of the theme system lay in its method of recruitment and land tenure. Within each theme, soldiers, known as stratiotai, were granted inalienable plots of land, often hereditary, in exchange for their military service and that of their descendants. These farmers were responsible for equipping themselves, or at least providing a significant portion of their own arms and armor, and for presenting themselves for duty when called upon by their strategos. This system had several profound advantages. It created a large, locally based, and highly motivated defensive force. These were not distant mercenaries or conscripts fighting for an abstract emperor. They were men defending their own homes, their own families, their own land. Their loyalty was deeply rooted in the soil they tilled and the communities they protected. The theme system also significantly reduced the financial burden on the central imperial treasury, as these farmers were, to a large extent, self-supporting, at least in terms of their basic livelihood. It fostered a strong sense of local identity and resilience, turning the provinces of Anatolia into a formidable defensive bulwark against Arab incursions. For centuries, the thematic armies formed the backbone of Byzantine military power, a testament to this innovative socio-military adaptation. Alongside the thematic infantry, Byzantium also continued to develop and refine its heavy cavalry, a critical component in an age where mounted warfare was becoming increasingly dominant. The cataphractoi, were the elite shock troops of the Byzantine army, a direct evolution of the late Roman and Sasanian heavy cavalry traditions. These were truly formidable warriors, encased, both man and horse, in heavy lamellar or mail armor, making them almost impervious to many contemporary weapons. They were armed with a long lance, the kontos, for the initial devastating charge, a heavy sword, the spathion, a descendant of the Roman spatha, for close-quarter combat, and often a powerful composite bow, allowing them to engage the enemy with missile fire before, during, and after the charge. This combination of heavy armor, shock capability, and missile power made the Byzantine cataphract arguably the most effective and versatile heavy cavalryman of his era, a precursor to the later medieval knights of Western Europe, but often with a greater degree of tactical flexibility due to their archery skills. Deployed in dense, wedge-shaped formations, a charge by Byzantine cataphracts could shatter enemy infantry lines and overwhelm lighter cavalry. Their very appearance on the battlefield was often enough to instill terror in their opponents. Byzantine military manuals, such as the Strategikon attributed to Emperor Maurice, late 6th, early 7th century, and the Tactica of Emperor Leo V the Wise, early 10th century, provide detailed descriptions of cataphract equipment, training, and tactical deployment, reflecting the sophisticated military science that underpinned their effectiveness. And then there was Byzantium's ultimate trump card, its technological ace. In the whole, particularly in naval warfare, Greek fire, the exact composition of this incendiary weapon remains a closely guarded secret, lost to history, though it was likely a petroleum-based mixture, perhaps containing naphtha, sulfur, and quicklime, which ignited on contact with water, making it incredibly difficult to extinguish. Deployed from siphons, bronze tubes mounted on the prows of Byzantine warships, the dromons, Greek fire, could project a stream of liquid flame onto enemy vessels, engulfing them in an inferno. Its psychological impact was immense, sowing terror and disarray among enemy fleets. As we saw, it played a decisive role in the successful defense of Constantinople during the great Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries, and it remained a critical component of Byzantine naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. It was, in essence, the superweapon of its age, a closely guarded state secret that gave Byzantium a crucial technological edge. The Byzantine navy itself, though often overshadowed by the exploits of its land armies, was a vital instrument of imperial power. Controlling the sea lanes of the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean was essential for trade, for communication between the disparate parts of the empire, and for projecting power onto hostile coasts or supporting land campaigns. The dromon, the standard Byzantine warship, was a swift, oared galley, often equipped with both Greek fire projectors and catapults, designed for both ramming and boarding actions. A well-maintained and skillfully led fleet was indispensable for the defense of Constantinople itself, with its vulnerable maritime approaches, and for maintaining Byzantium's status as a major commercial and political power. These military innovations, the theme system, the elite cataphracts, the terrifying Greek fire, and a capable navy, combined with a sophisticated diplomatic service that was adept at playing potential enemies off against each other, and a deep reservoir of administrative and logistical expertise inherited from Rome, allowed the Byzantine Empire not only to survive the initial Arab onslaught, but to stabilize its frontiers and, eventually, to enter a period of renewed strength and expansion, often referred to as the Macedonian Renaissance. This Golden Age, primarily associated with the Macedonian dynasty 867-1056 CE, saw Byzantium go on the offensive. Emperors like Nikephoros Siphocus, a brilliant but harsh soldier emperor, John Zimisces, another successful military leader, and, above all, Basil Sekuru, known grimly as Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar Slayer, pushed back the empire's enemies on multiple fronts. Nikephoros Phocas and John Zimisces reconquered Crete from the Arabs, a vital naval base, and pushed deep into Syria, even briefly threatening Jerusalem. They reasserted Byzantine dominance in the eastern Mediterranean and re-established a strong Byzantine presence in the Levant. The disciplined thematic armies, supported by the heavy cataphracts, proved more than a match for the often fragmented Arab emirates of the period. But it was Basil Severin whose reign marked the zenith of Byzantine military power in this era. For decades, he waged a relentless, brutal war against the First Bulgarian Empire, a powerful and persistent rival in the Balkans. This was a long, grinding conflict, fought with savage determination on both sides. Basil Ciro was a stern, ascetic, and utterly ruthless commander, often leading his armies in person, sharing the hardships of his troops. His most infamous, and arguably most decisive, victory came at the Battle of Cleidion in 1014. After a crushing defeat of the Bulgarian army, Basil reportedly ordered some 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners to be blinded, leaving only one man in every 100 with one eye to lead his comrades home. This act of calculated cruelty, though the numbers may be exaggerated by chroniclers, shattered Bulgarian morale, and, within a few years, led to the complete subjugation of the Bulgarian Empire. By the time of Basil Severin's death in 1025, the Byzantine Empire stretched from southern Italy to Armenia, from the Danube to Syria. It was larger, wealthier, and more secure than it had been for centuries. This period of resurgence was also marked by a flourishing of Byzantine culture, art, and learning, fueled by the relative peace and prosperity that military success had brought. Byzantine military science itself was highly developed, with numerous treatises and manuals being written and studied, codifying tactics, strategy, logistics, and siegecraft. These texts, drawing on centuries of Roman and Hellenistic military experience, reflected a sophisticated, analytical, and adaptable approach to warfare. Unlike some of their more impetuous Western European contemporaries, Byzantine commanders often favored caution, maneuver, and the exploitation of enemy weaknesses over risky, head-on confrontations. Diplomacy, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare were considered integral parts of military strategy. The Byzantine army of this era was a complex, multi-layered, and highly professional force. At its core were the thematic armies, the citizen soldiers defending their localities. Supporting them were the tagmata, elite mobile regiments based in or near Constantinople, including the famous Varangian Guard, composed largely of Scandinavian and later Anglo-Saxon mercenaries, renowned for their loyalty and ferocity in battle, and wielding their fearsome two-handed axes. And spearheading major offensives were the heavily armored cataphracts. It was a military system that, for a time, seemed to have found the perfect balance between local defense and offensive capability, between citizen, militia, and professional elite. It seemed as though Byzantium, the heir of Rome, had weathered the worst of the storms and had reasserted its position as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. Its armies were victorious, its frontiers secure, its culture vibrant. But history is a relentless cycle of rise and fall, of strength and vulnerability. Even at the height of its power under Basil Sekuru, new threats were beginning to gather on the distant horizons, particularly from the east, where a new Turkic people, the Seljuks, were on the move. and internal weaknesses, complacency, and political rivalries, those age-old enemies of empires, were beginning to gnaw at the foundations of Byzantine strength. The Golden Age, like all golden ages, would prove to be tragically, and perhaps inevitably, brief. The next great test for Byzantine arms, a test that would have catastrophic consequences, was fast approaching. Part 5. The enduring legacy and timeless lessons. Constantinople had fallen. The cannons of Mehmed II had breached the proud Theodosian walls, writing a tragic final chapter for an empire that had endured for nearly 15 centuries, a direct continuation of the ancient Roman state. The two-headed eagle of Byzantium, the symbol of a dual heritage, had finally been brought low. The Roman military tradition, a continuous current flowing for over 2 millennia, from the citizen farmers by the Tiber to the sophisticated thematic armies and armored cataphracts of the Eastern Roman Empire, seemed to have reached its dramatic and perhaps definitive end. But was that truly the final word? Can such a monumental legacy simply vanish into the ether, buried beneath the rubble of a conquered city? Or does it live on, quietly yet powerfully, woven into the fabric of our military doctrines, our organizational structures, our engineering, and even into the very way we think about warfare, power, and the nature of empires today? The military history of Rome and its Byzantine successor is a vast, sprawling epic of adaptation, innovation, and an almost superhuman endurance. Consider their journey from the flexible manipular formations learned from the Samnites themselves, to the audacious creation of a navy from scratch to confront Carthage, anchored by the ingenious Corvus. Think of Marius's reforms that professionalized the legions and tragically altered their loyalties, or Augustus's establishment of a standing, frontier-based imperial army that would guarantee the Pax Romana for generations. And then in the East, we saw the remarkable resilience shown through the development of the theme system, which turned provinces into self-sustaining military districts, the terrifying effectiveness of Greek fire, which saved Constantinople on more than one occasion, and the evolution of the heavily armored cataphract, a battlefield titan that dominated for centuries. This was not a static tradition, content to rest on past glories. It was a living, breathing entity, constantly evolving, learning from its enemies, and responding to the ever-changing challenges of a dangerous world. One of the most crucial, yet often underappreciated, pillars of this enduring success was their unparalleled mastery of logistics and military engineering. The famous Roman roads were not mere arteries of commerce, they were strategic highways, enabling the swift deployment and sustained supply of vast armies across immense territories. Their fortified camps, their sophisticated siegecraft, their aqueducts, and their defensive walls were not just feats of construction, they were instruments of conquest, control, and imperial administration. These capabilities, inherited and adapted by the Byzantines, allowed them to project power and maintain cohesion over vast, often hostile, landscapes in a way few other pre-modern states could ever hope to achieve. The echoes of this engineering prowess can still be seen in the infrastructure of Europe and the Near East, a tangible reminder of their organizational genius. The Roman concept of bellimustum, the just war, though often pragmatically interpreted, even cynically manipulated to legitimize expansionist policies, introduced a profound and enduring ethical dimension to the conduct of warfare. The idea that war required a justification beyond mere aggression or ambition, that it should adhere to certain procedures and be waged for defensible reasons, laid a foundational element for the long tradition of thought on the ethics of conflict within Western civilization. While its application was often flawed, the very existence of such a framework, managed by the official priests in Rome, set a precedent for attempting to regulate and rationalize the brutal reality of armed conflict that echo even in our modern international legal frameworks. Ultimately, the military legacy of Rome and Byzantium lies not just in their specific victories or defeats, nor in the sheer scale of their empires. It resides in their enduring contributions to military theory, strategy, organization, and the very art of war. From the decimal structure of the legion to the principles of discipline, training, and logistics, from the sophisticated military manuals of Byzantine emperors to the enduring physical monuments of their military engineering, many aspects of Roman and Byzantine warfare were studied, adopted, and adapted by later military powers. From medieval knights to Renaissance strategists, and even to the military thinkers of the modern era. The story of their rise and fall, the centuries of warfare that defined their existence, offers timeless lessons about the complex, often perilous, interplay between military power, political stability, economic strength, and the relentless tides of historical change. The astonishing resilience of the Eastern Roman Empire for nearly 1,000 years after the collapse of the West serves as a powerful testament to its ability to adapt, to innovate, and to endure against almost overwhelming odds. It reminds us that while empires may crumble and civilizations may transform, the human capacity for organization, for innovation in the face of adversity, and the enduring quest for security and dominance are themes that resonate across the ages, etched into the very fabric of our shared past. The echoes of their legions, their strategies, and their indomitable spirit continue to inform and challenge us long after their banners have turned to dust.